Welcome to Morbid Matters, where we discuss everything from the horrors of history to the true crime of today. Be sure to give me a follow on my social media platforms for other interesting stories. And be sure to grab your submachine guns and overcoats, because we're talking about 1920s Chicago gangs in this episode. I actually lived in Chicago for a few years during my really bad phase, and literally all I did was just a ton of stuff that I shouldn't have been doing and can't really say on here. But that's all I associate Chicago with now, is just this criminal element, and I can't get over it. Definitely don't recommend, and that was a personal story that no one asked for. So today we're going to do a Valentine's Day related story. Most of us associate Valentine's Day with chocolate, romance, love, cards, all that kind of stuff. But on Valentine's Day 1929 in Lincoln Park, Chicago, the day of love turned into a day of terror. Seven members and associates of Chicago's North Side Gang were gathered at a Lincoln Park garage/warehouse at 2122 North Clark Street. The men were lined up against a wall and shot by four unknown assailants. Two of whom were dressed as police officers, and the other two were wearing street clothes, which included suits, ties, overcoats, and hats. This was pretty typical for gangsters of the time period. Witnesses saw the two men wearing police uniforms, leading the two other men outside of the garage at gunpoint after the shooting. The seven men were shot with weapons, which included a Thompson machine gun, and these bad boys are a very high-powered, fast-action automatic weapon. The victims of this shooting included five members of Chicago's North Side Gang, which was run by a man named Bugs Moran, also known as Bugs. Everyone called him Bugs. All these gangsters, they have weird nicknames. That's just a thing. Moran's second-in-command and brother-in-law, Albert Katchlak, was killed, along with Adam Heiner, the gang's bookkeeper and manager, Albert Weinshank, who operated several cleaning and dyeing operations for the Morans, and gang enforcers Frank and Peter Gusenberg, who were brothers. The two associates of the gang who were also killed were Reinhard H. Schwimmer, a former optician who turned gambler and was now an associate of this gang, and John May, who was the gang's occasional mechanic. Like, he was a light associate. Both of these guys were just kind of light associates who just happened to be there on the wrong day, really. When the real police showed up at the scene, they found that Frank Gusenberg was actually still alive, despite being shot 14 times. So they take Frank to the hospital to stabilize him, and they're trying to get him to answer questions while he's conscious. So the police ask him, "Who shot you?" To which Frank responded, "No one shot me." Then he dies 3 hours later. So either he was just mentally not there from being shot so many times and he genuinely didn't know what happened, or he was so afraid of the people who shot him that he wasn't going to risk ratting them out. So the whole reason behind this massacre was an attempt to take the head off of the snake, so to speak. They really wanted to get Bugs Moran, the gang's leader, and it's highly speculated that this was all organized by Al Capone himself, even though Capone was at his home in Florida at the time of the shootings. And the reason being was that the North Side Gang was thought to have hijacked a shipment of illegal whiskey from Al Capone's gang that was being sent in from Canada via the Detroit River. Now remember, this was all during the time of Prohibition, which outlawed the sale and consumption of alcohol. And this is what gave rise to all these gangs coming in the first place, because the sale of alcohol was such a huge business. And gangs still do this today with other substances that are illegal, but it was a bigger thing in the 1920s and 30s, especially in places like Chicago, because of all the organization and violence that was going on. But it's almost like when you make things illegal, especially a certain substance or item, people are still going to want to obtain that substance or item. And now you've just added a whole new criminal element by making it a black market item. At this point, Moran was now the last surviving leader of the North Side Gang. The original leader of the gang, Dan O'Banion, had been murdered, and his successors, Jaime Weiss and Vincent Drucci, were killed in the violence that followed O'Banion's death. Moran and his gang were Capone's biggest rivals, and the two had been trying to gain complete control over the very lucrative Chicago bootlegging trade. Moran had also been trying to take control over one of Capone's dog tracks in the Chicago suburbs. Moran had also taken several saloons that had been owned by Capone, now insisting that they were his territory. So the original plan for this massacre was to lure Moran into the warehouse on February 14th, 1929, kill him and maybe 2 to 3 of his lieutenants, which would have basically crippled the North Side gang and gotten them out of the way at least long enough for Capone to have seized total control. It's assumed that the gang was lured there under the false promise of a stolen cut-rate shipment of whiskey supplied by Detroit's Purple Gang, which was affiliated with Capone's gang. The Gusenberg brothers, who were, again, the enforcers of the North Side gang, were supposed to drive 2 empty trucks to Detroit that day to pick up 2 loads of stolen Canadian whiskey. All of the victims were dressed in their best clothes. I mean, say what you will about 1920s gangsters, but these guys really knew how to dress. They just always looked so snazzy. So most of Moran's gang gets there at 10:30 a.m., except for Bugs Moran himself. Bugs and a fellow gang member named Ted Newberry were driving there together, and they got there later than everyone else. They also saw a police car around the building, so they booked it the fuck out of there and went to a local coffee shop nearby. They also saw Henry Gusenberg, another one of the Gusenberg brothers that were all in this gang, and I'm sure their mother was super proud of that. They saw him on the street on their way out, so they warned him not to go to the meet at the garage. Willie Marks, another Northside gang member, also saw the police car on his way to the garage, and he ducked into a doorway. He jots down the license plate of this police car before he books it out of the neighborhood. Well, it would seem that Capone's men also ended up mistaking one of Moran's men for Moran himself. It was probably Albert Weinshank because they were apparently about the same height and build, and they had been wearing the same colored overcoat and hat that day. There were witnesses outside of the garage who saw a Cadillac sedan pull up to a stop in front of the garage. 4 men got out and walked inside. 2 of them were dressed in police uniforms. The 2 fake cops carried shotguns and entered the rear portion of the garage where they found the 5 members and 2 associates of the Northside gang who had showed up. The 2 fake cops ordered the men to line up against the wall. They give a signal to the other 2 men who were dressed normally. That's when 2 of the killers opened fire with the Thompson machine guns, and they thoroughly sprayed bullets all over these men, even continuing to fire after the victims had hit the ground. 6 of them likely died instantly, aside from Frank, who somehow survived 14 gunshots for several more hours. Obviously, people would have heard all these gunshots, so to give the appearance that the police were already on the scene handling it, the 2 fake cops escorted the other 2 men in street clothes out of the warehouse with guns placed behind their heads, like they were already arresting them. The only true survivor of this massacre was the mechanic John May's dog named Highball. Thankfully, they didn't kill the poor dog. The aftermath of the Valentine's Day massacre was a big deal. There was a ton of press surrounding it, and the public outcry created a problem for all mob bosses. They now had too much public attention, as well as the police cracking down on them even harder. Capone was sent a summons to testify before a Chicago grand jury on charges of violating probation, but he claimed he was too unwell to attend. Capone did have syphilis, which ended up killing him, and it's a pretty gnarly STD. If left untreated, it basically rots your brain and other organs. Well, since police didn't have much on Capone himself, they focused their efforts on Detroit's Purple Gang, which was associated with the Capone outfit. 2 landladies had taken in 3 men as tenants in their boarding house, which was right across the street from the garage. And these men all moved in only 10 days before the massacre. The landladies picked out mugshots of several Purple Gang members: George Lewis, Eddie Fletcher, Phil Keywell, and his younger brother Harry. But the landladies later said that they couldn't tell if it was really these men or not. I'm assuming these ladies probably got threats, or they just got scared of the implications of potentially going after gang members. The police questioned and cleared Fletcher, Lewis, and Harry Keywell. Nevertheless, the Keywell brothers, and by extension the Purple Gang, remained associated with the crime in the years that followed. Many people also believe that the police really were involved, which may have been the intention of the killers, but it's also possible that the police really were involved. Chicago police are corrupt, and they were definitely corrupt in the 20s, corrupt enough to do something like this. The only real lead that police ever had wasn't until December of 1929, when Michigan police raided the home of a man named Frederick Dane. So Dane tried to escape in his car when police showed up to his bungalow. A bungalow is like a smaller house, basically. A high-speed chase ensued, and Frank managed to get away after he shot a police officer. But when police searched the bungalow that Dane was living in, they found a bulletproof vest, 2 machine guns, a ton of ammo, and about $320,000 in cash that had recently been stolen from a Wisconsin bank. They also discovered that Frederick Dane was just this man's alias. His real name was Fred Burke, and he was wanted in Chicago for questioning about his potential involvement in the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. Given everything that he did and what police found in this guy's house, he was obviously a gangster and a known contract killer. Forensic ballistics back then was still in its infancy. They didn't have all the technology to trace bullets and shell casings the way we do today with computers. Back then, it was all done manually. But police still managed to link weapons found in Burke's bungalow to the weapons used in the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. Burke was finally caught a year later in Missouri, and he ended up doing life in prison for shooting the police officer. But Burke would end up dying in 1940, and he never gave any information on his involvement with the massacre, and he definitely didn't snitch on any of his co-conspirators. So the case went cold until January of 1935, when the FBI raided an apartment complex in Chicago looking for members of the Barker Gang. They ended up catching some of them, including a man named Byron Bolton, who came to be known as a geyser of information. Apparently this guy would tell police anything. I guess he didn't adhere to the no snitching policy. Without hesitating, Byron claimed that he and Fred Burke had been involved in the massacre. But he told this to the FBI, who at the time had no jurisdiction over gang-related matters. Even J. Edgar Hoover himself told the FBI not to get involved in this case. But Bolton's claims were still leaked to newspapers, and people got interested again. Bolton claimed the assassination had been in the works since October of 1928. The plan took place at a hotel in Wisconsin where he met Burke along with Al Capone. Bolton's job was to watch over the warehouse and alert the others when Bugs Moran arrived, which he thought that he did, but it would turn out that he had the wrong guy, and Bugs was still alive. Most people believe Bolton was making all of this up for attention. I guess he was just that type of guy. Except for a widow of one of the thugs involved in the massacre, named Georgette Winkler. She confirmed parts of Bolton's story, and she added that her husband and Bolton had been part of a special group Capone had named American Boys. They were in charge of all high-risk jobs. William Drury, who was one of the detectives who had been on this case from the beginning, also confirmed these facts. Although I'm somewhat questioning the wife a bit too, because isn't that kind of a huge deal about being a gangster, is that you don't tell your family about your job? Again, I'm basing this all off of my knowledge of the movie Goodfellas. So, long story short, there was a ton of runaround with detectives getting leads and them not really going anywhere. And although there's been several suspects, there was never enough concrete evidence to say who the gunmen actually were. So this case is still officially unsolved from nearly 100 years ago. And that will be it for the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. If you enjoyed this case or any other true crime and horror stories, please give me a like and follow, because that's what I do. And whether or not you're single or in a relationship or go out or stay in this Valentine's Day, please just enjoy your day and try not to get murdered by a rival gang.